This video today we're going to talk about watersheds, key components of natural ecosystems. And our goal is to describe what is a watershed and how we as humans can impact the health of a watershed. This picture here is of Charleston, Oregon, which is actually pretty close to where I grew up. It's on the southern Oregon coast, close to Coos Bay and North Bend, Oregon. And we're looking at here, you can see these little bodies of water here. This is from streams or rivers that are going to feed into this bay here, Charleston Bay, and then this is actually the Pacific Ocean out here in the distance. So we're going to take a look at what makes up a watershed to start, and really it's the land that surrounds and drains rain and snowmelt and water into a lake, a wetland, or a river. So we can see in our image here we've got various forms of precipitation, falls, and then it runs down and it collects in these little streams and tributaries, and then eventually gets into larger and larger bodies of water. So it would be like small rivers flowing into bigger rivers, and then those bigger rivers merging and eventually getting out into the ocean. And the watershed is the land that surrounds all of those small rivers and tributaries and portions, waterways that feed into the larger areas. In your notes for this portion, it'd be helpful to make a quick sketch to show all these different portions of the watershed and what is included in it. And here's another image that shows kind of a breakdown of the different portions of it. We have streams, we have our wetlands, the land, the groundwater, and the surface water. In the previous picture we didn't talk about the groundwater, but that's an important part of a watershed, and it's actually all of the water that's under the ground, and is also can be used as a source of drinking water or wells to tap that water for use. For humans, there's a lot of natural groundwater that cities around the United States and around the world rely on as a source of water, where that water collects underground. So wetlands are a big portion of a watershed, and they're areas of standing water, and they have unique plants called hydrophytes that are adapted to be able to survive within an area that has standing water, like we see right here. And so what they help to do is to slow down how quickly the water moves, and also to store it, to provide a place that it can store. And it helps to protect areas from flooding. It provides habitat for animals. It helps actually to filter out the water. The plants actually help to filter the water and help to clean it, essentially, specifically with pollutants, and can make drinking water cleaner. And here's an image that kind of looks at a cross-section of a wetland, where we have our standing water and a variety of different hydrophytes, plants that can live within that standing water, and then the top, kind of the land, and then sunk it down a little bit here as well. They provide water and also natural resources that we as human needs. They provide and help to clean water, provide habitat for fish and birds, as we talked about previously. They can provide hydropower, places to live, jobs, recreation. There's a lot of advantages of watersheds, and you maybe have visited some before and probably seen a lot of wildlife within the area. So how do humans impact watersheds? Well, a lot of that is just by being in the area and building farms and cities. For example, here we've got rain that comes down, it runs off of the roof of this house, collects in the gutters, from the lawn, and it runoffs into the streets, and then that can then, it would be called stormwater, and then can end up, not always, but can end up in local streams, creeks, rivers, and lakes. And so the problem with that is if there's any pollutants on the house, from the lawn, maybe from fertilizer, from the street, all of that then eventually will run into the streams, creeks, rivers, lakes, if it's not being collected and sent to some sort of water treatment plant. Probably one of the most common things is from fertilizers. The ways that humans impact watersheds is through fertilizers, from farming and crops. We'll talk about that in just a second, but also sometimes sewage. In the Portland metro area, sometimes years ago, if it rained a lot, some of the sewer pipes would overflow, and unfortunately that then would overflow into the Willamette River, which obviously is really gross, sewer going into the river, but that is an unfortunate side effect that can sometimes happen just by having cities and buildings within the area of these different watersheds. So I mentioned fertilizers, but one of the biggest impacts of humans on watersheds is through fertilizer. You have crops, you want these crops to grow as much as possible, so you add fertilizer to help them to be able to grow faster. That makes sense. It's helpful. Within that fertilizer is extra nitrogen and phosphorus, which helps those plants to go. Unfortunately, one of the problems with that, though, also is that usually not all of that nitrogen and phosphorus is going to be used. So when it rains or when those crops, those farmlands are watered, all of that excess is going to run off and will eventually get into streams, rivers, lakes. The problem that then causes is it creates this really happy environment for algae to grow. And that algae grows because there's so much extra nitrogen and phosphorus. That, as a result, promotes bacteria that eat the algae to flourish because they have a ton of food. And not only do they start to spread and to bloom, but they also begin using up all of the oxygen in the water. So it creates kind of two different problems. One, the bacteria layer in the algae covers up the water surface, and so you get what's called these algae blooms, and you can even sometimes see them from space if they're large enough. You can see them from space, from satellites. This bloom of all of this algae and bacteria that covers the water surface, and what that does is it prohibits or limits sunlight from being able to pass through the water and get to the plants that live in the water for them to be able to photosynthesize. And if they can't photosynthesize, then they're not able to produce their own food. It also promotes problems because then the bacteria use up the oxygen in the water. So although fish don't breathe like we would as humans, they need oxygen to pass through their gills to be able to survive. And if they're not able to get oxygen because it's been removed by the bacteria, then they can't survive. It's basically like suffocating. So they're not able to survive and they die. And any other organism that needs oxygen. And so this thing creates these dead zones or anoxic zones where basically nothing is alive. So this whole process is called eutrophication, and it's really, really bad. And it does happen. You see it happen sometimes in the Gulf of Mexico or any lakes where lots of runoff, fertilizer runoff will collect. We do see this happen quite a bit in the natural environment, unfortunately, because of our impact, primarily through fertilization. So that's a little bit about watersheds and some of the ways that we can affect them. We'll look at some more examples in class.